Welcome back to Close Up. 2020 was a year of confronting big things. One of those defining issues was and is racism. Here in New Hampshire, several high-profile conversations were launched about how this state can do better across a number of fronts. That conversation continues in 2021 and beyond, and we're going to revisit it today with Joanna Kelly of the Seacoast African American Cultural Center and Ryan Terrell of Nashua, former nominee to the State Board of Ed and 2020 Republican candidate for state rep. Thank you to you both for joining us. And Joanna, I'd like to start with you. Just want to get your reactions to what unfolded in Washington on January 6th. A lot of people, particularly dedicated supporters of President Trump, want to compare and contrast with Black Lives Matter marches from last year. How does that strike you?
Well, it's disappointing to start. I think that President-elect Biden said it the best, that if it was a Black Lives Matter protest, it would have been handled extremely different. It's just sad to me that people want to compare the two. We had a armed mob storm our Capitol.
What about you, Ryan? What's your perspective on this and that comparison being drawn?
Yeah, I think that the actions committed by those on the 6th are inexcusable. Anytime people break the law, especially use violence to communicate what they're trying to communicate, is wrong. At the same time, I do understand why people are making the comparisons, because the through line between both groups is that they use violence and law breaking to get across their messages. And that was true for what happened on the 6th. It was also true for the months of rioting that BLM groups, factions, Antifa factions, and other factions have been doing across the United States.
What do you think about that, Joanna? Is there an equivalency there?
I think I agree with Ryan. I think that there are ways that things can be handled without breaking the law. And I think that, unfortunately, especially in some moments of the BLM movement, it's been dampered by infighting and by rioting.
And that's one of the difficult things, trying to separate out who's who in these crowds. You know, in social media, everything gets sent right up the flagpole, and suddenly it's like, you're all this, you're all that. I'm curious, from your perspective, Ryan, you come at this from a conservative perspective. We did see in Washington on January 6th a commingling of sort of the normal Trump base and some very radical white supremacist people who were attacking police officers, beating people with the American flag. Is that association problematic for you as a Republican?
It is problematic, because what it does is actually tarnish the brand and the history of what being a Republican means. I'll be clear with the audience here is that the reason why I'm a Republican is very simple, because the Republican Party was created to free slaves. And that's the reason why I've always been a Republican. And unfortunately, this extreme version of the party and the different factions of the party are bringing a lot of heat towards the entire party in itself. But the GOP is not innocent in it, in the sense that they've not done a good job, as far as I'm concerned, differentiating themselves between the traditional Republican values that were formed on and these different factions that we're seeing in response to Trump's presidency and also in the January 6th event.
Joanna, one of the really difficult aspects of the racial justice movement right now seems to be that for a lot of people, even bringing up the topic is construed as being divisive. Just making that ask for equality in their eyes somehow starts an argument. How do you make progress with that kind of mindset standing in the way?
Well, you know, I look at myself. I'm a woman, so I obviously believe in gender equality. I am an African American, so I believe in racial equality. I'm a small business owner, so I believe in protecting our small business owners. And I say that because I think it's very important that people are aware that we wear multiple hats. And so, of course, it's going to be decisive at some point because it doesn't affect everyone the same way. But I think that when we have the conversation, we need to have the conversation of overall equality for people.
And what's your perspective on this, Ryan? Obviously, you were part of a conversation last year when you were a nominee for the Board of Ed. That for a lot of people, you know, turned inside out, sort of these conversations about, you know, who's qualified and who's not qualified. When that conversation comes up now, how do we approach that? How do we make progress?
I think I agree with Joanna in the sense that we have to be factual, and we also have to look at our own stories. You know, as she says, she's a business owner. I've had a great professional career in New Hampshire. And so getting people to the table, as WMUR have done and as you've done, Adam, to have these conversations with the public and be open and honest about what the dynamics that we're dealing with. The reality is that being an African American in America, or being any minority in America, is going to lend you a different life experience experience than other groups, and being honest about what those life experiences are, and then also sharing how we can all benefit from those life experiences has been the way that, at least in my life, we move forward on very sticky progress issues like this.
I'm curious for both of your perspectives on something that unfolded in the November election. Again, not fitting into sort of the typical narrative of things. Even though the numbers weren't huge, President Trump did improve his standing among voters of color. He did well, or better than he did in 2016 in some urban areas. And I'm curious, Joanna, a lot of people are trying to wrestle with this. They believe that President Trump conveys a worldview that is antithetical to making that kind of progress, and yet he did. What are your thoughts there?
I think it goes back to that people wear many hats. And to me, the vote and the conversation about race should not be a conversation of party lines. And I think that is a great example of it. You can be an African American and support that president, and you could be an African American and be anti-Trump. But to me, it's so much more of a conversation than just party lines and race.
What about you, Ryan? What do you think President Trump was able to do to make those inroads with voters of color?
I think what Trump did well is identify some of those core issues that were addressing the African American community and slowing progress there. He made a lot of inroads because when he started to look at the education system, started to address things like workforce readiness and dependency on government programs, once you start to apply some type of pressure to improving those systems, those are some of the foundational programs that are going to improve any minority group. But then also what he did was similar to what Joanna said. He was approaching it in a way that was outside of party lines. And unfortunately, we conflate race and different issues into party lines when these are just human social issues that we need to look outside of party philosophy and figuring out how do we address those. And I think Trump did well in a few areas with the African American community, which is why he made those inroads.
And yet the rhetoric turned a lot of people off, frankly. I mean, the very fine people on both sides. How do you reconcile those things, Ryan?
The use of rhetoric, and it's a great point, because unfortunately what we've seen in modern day is no longer using words as they were intended to be used. And because we no longer use words in the way that we intended them to use in the beginning, is that rhetoric has created a divisive environment that simply, if you do not agree with the facts of the matter, you can use rhetoric to change the narrative or completely change sort of the context of what's being said. And I think that that's true on both sides, whether we want to talk across political aisles, but it's true also in modern society. We are living in a world today that we're no longer as willing to accept different viewpoints from others as we once were.
And what do you think, Joanna, that we're getting into some pretty intellectual territory here, but the idea of language and reality being in conflict in some ways when we talk about President Trump and race?
I find myself in agreement with what Ryan has just said, that rhetoric can be so dangerous. And I think that, unfortunately, I think the president has used some pretty dangerous rhetoric, but I do think that it's been used as a substitute to actual ideas, and when I look at this administration, to actual legislation that can be passed to help American people.
I do want to talk a little bit about what's going on here in New Hampshire and making progress on the racial justice front. A lot of the conversation in 2020 was about police accountability. And I'd like to know, if they don't pass at the State House all of the reforms that Governor Sununu backed, is that problematic for you? And Joanna, we'll start with you. Does this need to be passed en masse to create reform?
Of course. I think, I look at that New Hampshire is one of the states that has the highest amount of settlements with the New Hampshire State Police. It's a huge problem here. And I know that we constantly talk about it's going to cost millions of dollars to reform. And I think that that's true. And it has to be something that we do. I look at Portsmouth, which has declared itself a racial justice municipality, and it's taken on the burden to retrain in some of our police officers and board members and city council, in making progress in that way. So while I do think that it has to be done on the state level and these reforms have to get through, we also have to look at individual municipalities to take on that responsibility also.
What about you, Ryan? Do these reforms need to be passed en masse, or it's not a win, or can it be incremental?
I think that any progress is progress. So it's hard to say that if they don't pass en masse, then it's not worth it. I think that Police Accountability Commission was well represented with members of the community and also members of the law enforcement community, BLM, and community leaders. So their suggestions are very well thought, and any progress that we can make on any number of those should be done. And any progress, like I said, that's small, that's what it takes to ultimately get to where we're all trying to go. And I will note, too, that I've had several communications with particularly the Manchester Police Department. Actually, on Friday, March 13th, I did a ride-along in Manchester. And our police department, with what Joanna mentioned, they do a good job, and they are highly performing professionals that hold themselves to a high standard. And so I think it's to mention that while there can be progress that's made, there's also a good job that's being done right now. And so we're always looking to improve. And that's why that Police Commission and Accountability Commission did such a good job, and why Governor Sununu did a good job at getting everybody together to get those tangible solutions that can move forward some accountability.
All right, Ryan Terrell of Nashua and Joanna Kelly of the Seacoast African American Cultural Center, thanks so much for joining us on Close Up. We'll have you back sometime in the future.
Thank you very much, Adam.